Hey, AP Bio, it is me, Miss Willis, and I'm going to talk to you about human impacts and human disruption on our ecosystem. So we're going to look at some of the things that humans do to make a significant impact on the world's systems. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, there's really three main causes of extinction or impacts on these systems. And the first thing is that there's a lot of people on this earth. We're at 7 billion and increasing, and so all of those people require some natural resources. Also, some countries do have weak or no laws governing human disruption and human impacts on their systems. And lastly, especially in the developed countries, we tend to have very high consumption rates. So we use things that we don't necessarily need. And if you just take a look at this graph here, you can see there is a connection between the number of humans on this earth and the number of species. And as humans increase, unfortunately, the number of species decreases. So what are some of these things we're doing to impact our systems? Well, number one, definitely cutting down habitat for other organisms for the sake of our houses or homes or development. And then also we can fragment populations. So when we build things, sometimes we tend to leave little pockets of natural area, but those fragments are cut off from other populations in the area. A cool technique that has been used to connect fragmented populations because of human impact is what you see here. This is a wildlife corridor, and it allows organisms to travel across, for example, freeways in a safe manner. Another thing that we do to disrupt systems is hunting and poaching. So killing organisms for food or for trophies, for sports, and also poaching, so removing items from the organism for purposes that are not necessarily for survival. Here's some pictures. There's a bear. We have a rhino being poached here. These are elephant tusks that have been poached. And of course, tiger skins that have also been poached. And not only tiger, there's other cats there in the mix. I was just watching a show the other day that talked about the pangolin here and how it is the #1 poached organism in the world. And that is because people are using their scales for medicinal purposes. People love seafood, and so in order to meet that demand, we tend to fish. But currently, some of the world's populations are being overfished. Too much of the organism is being taken out of the water. In fishing the world's oceans, sometimes what happens is things come up in the net that necessarily aren't wanted, and we call that bycatch. So here in this trawl bag, you see there's a plethora of shrimp, but then you'll also notice that there's a shark on top, and so that shark would be considered bycatch, and it's usually thrown overboard. Also, what we're doing is removing the top predators from these ocean systems. A lot of people like to eat tuna and swordfish, and these organisms do keep the lower populations of fish in check. So when you remove those, you are greatly disturbing the food webs of the oceans. So that leads us to trophic cascades. And so when you do remove things like the top predators, sometimes you do see very dramatic changes throughout the food web. That is usually because, like I just said, those top predators are regulating the populations underneath them in the food chain or the food web. And also, keystone species have the same sort of impact. So when you remove a keystone species, such as a sea otter or a gray wolf, those species tend to moderate their food web. And so when they're removed, you get lots of different changes that are happening in the food web. Another way that humans disrupt their environments is through the capture and sale of exotic species. A lot of people would like exotic species as pets, and so what happens sometimes is instead of being bred in those habitats. They're taken from their native habitat and transported to these countries where they are wanted. So what that involves is a lot of deaths in the transit of these organisms, and of course removal of these organisms from their native habitat. Also, as a side side effect, what happens sometimes is people don't want these pets anymore, and then what they do is they release them into the environment where they necessarily shouldn't be. So you get a release of these non-native species. Sometimes they do become invasive, and so for example, here in LA we have large populations of parakeets because people released their pet parakeets that were from the tropics. And how can we have a talk about human disruption without mentioning global climate change? So global climate change is caused by the heating of the earth. What humans are doing is they're putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. These greenhouse gases, they're already natural, but what humans are doing is we're increasing the amount that's in the atmosphere. So what happens is solar radiation, it comes in from the sun, it hits the earth and is reflected sometimes back out to space. Well, when it's reflected back out to space and there are greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, it doesn't allow that radiation to exit Earth. So it generally will just lead to an increase of heat on the Earth. And so what are some of those greenhouse gases that are contributing to global climate change? Well, those include carbon dioxide, methane, tropospheric ozone, nitrous oxide, and believe it or not, water vapor. Now, most of these, excluding water vapor, are usually emitted through burning coal, oil, and natural gas for energy purposes. Also, remember that nitrous oxides, they are often added to the atmosphere through the application of fertilizers. So when farmers go to put fertilizers on their ground, these fertilizers do vaporize and put nitrous oxides into the atmosphere. All of these chemicals will trap solar radiation and lead to the warming of the earth. I really do love this graph because it does show the correlation between temperature and carbon dioxide. So if you've noticed over the past years since the Industrial Revolution, the temperature of the Earth has increased. And look at that. Wouldn't you know that carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere have also increased? So there are three main global climate change effects that we're going to see. So we're going to see changes in temperature, changes in sea level, and changes in precipitation amounts. So how does that affect the ecosystems and human health? Definitely there's going to be habitat loss, storms, flooding. We may have an increase in disease due to mosquito increases. Air pollutants will increase. Food supply might be an issue as far as can it grow in these new environments. I mean, there's a plethora of impacts that could occur from this global climate change. Non-native species are also being introduced at an increased amount thanks to human involvement. Sometimes we introduce species that shouldn't be in an area on accident. Sometimes it is done on purpose. Either way, they can come into these environments and become invasive and spread out and take over these systems. So some examples are definitely the cane toads of Australia. We have here in the United States zebra mussels in the Great Lakes and nutria in Louisiana, and also they have found some of those here in Long Beach. This is another example of a non-native species. This was most likely a pet release. So someone released their Burmese python in Florida, and now they do have annual hunts every year to try to remove as many of these pythons that they can from nature. The lionfish of the Caribbean are also not native, although very cool to see. I've read a couple of stories on this. Some suspect that maybe it was a pet release. Some suspect that there was an aquarium that broke during a hurricane that introduced them. Either way, they're there and they shouldn't be there. So what is the problem with non-native or invasive exotic species? Well, really, they just cause extra competition with the native species. And because there is this competition, it leads to usually decreased populations of the native species. Sometimes these non-natives, like the cane toad, they contain a poison that will actually kill the natives. But in their native lands, it may be a case where some of the predators have grown immune to that poison, so it's really not an issue. Sometimes they do eat the same food resources as natives, so they're decreasing the amount of food. And then most of the time, they don't have natural predators in these new areas. And so there's really no organisms that's keeping their population in check. So they can reproduce with really no limits on their growth. And of course, again, here in Los Angeles, the American bullfrog is a non-native species, as well as any crayfish that you may see in our rivers and streams. With the extra demand in food, farmers have started to use more fertilizers to add nutrients to the ground. However, these fertilizers, they do not stay in place. They tend to run off with any water that is added to the land. Those fertilizers contain a lot of nitrogen, and when they get in the waterway, algae, they just love that nitrogen. They take it up and they bloom, and because they bloom, they actually will use up all their resources and then they will die, sink to the bottom where aerobic detritivores, organisms that eat this dead organic material, will consume them. However, their population will start to bloom, and because they are aerobic, this will actually lead to a decrease in oxygen in the water. We call this hypoxia. So when there is a decrease of oxygen in the water that really can't sustain life, we tend to call those hypoxic conditions. And lastly, again, with the food production, we have started using much more chemical pesticides on our food products. And of course, we do this to kill off the bugs so that we can have food and profits. What we're finding though is that some of these pesticides like DDT in the past, they do bioaccumulate up the food chain. So that means the little organisms on the lower end of the food chain, they take up, for example, the DDT, and then the fish that eat those little organisms eat them and they get the DDT, and it just keeps passing up the food chain. Organisms at the top of the food chain, they tend to become way more toxic. And that's because number one, they tend to have longer lifespans, but two, they have to eat a lot more to obtain that energy because of the rule of 10. So this does lead to the death of many top predatory animals. A good example, DDT was destroying the bald eagle population because DDT was interfering with the calcium uptake in these birds. So when they were laying their eggs, the shells were weak and it would break when they went to incubate them. So it really did decimate the bald eagle population. Of course, DDT is banned here now in the United States, and that eagle population has recovered. Okay, everyone, I hope that was good information about many of the things humans are doing to disrupt our ecosystems, and I will talk with you soon.